We have seen that since the vast majority of the inhabitants of the Greco-Roman world were polytheists, they did not believe that there was a great chasm between the divine and human realms. Instead, they understood that these realms could overlap. We've looked at one model of this overlap. Sometimes divine beings could become human beings. And so, for example, in the story told of Ovid, of Jupiter and Mercury visiting Phrygia in Asia Minor. In this lecture, we look at two other models for how there can be overlap between the divine and human realms. One involves how a human can be born to a god, making him a divine human. The other involves how a human could be exalted to heaven, usually at his death, in order to become one of the gods. We begin with people who were born to the sexual union of a god with a mortal. It was not uncommon for an exceedingly powerful or unbelievably intelligent person to be thought of as more than human. In some cases, that was because he was not, in fact, a mere mortal, but had one of the gods as his father. As it turns out, this is the case of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great is considered by many people to be the most important figure in the history of Western civilization as it developed out of the ancient world. That's because Alexander the Great went on a number of military campaigns, conquering the Mediterranean region and conquering lands as far east as the Persian Empire. And when Alexander conquered lands, he not only took over countries that were being controlled by other forces, he imposed a Greek form of culture on these lands, so that the lands around the Mediterranean became Greek-like or Hellenized. That's why Greek culture had spread throughout the Mediterranean, and it's why throughout the Mediterranean, all of the educated people spoke Greek. Alexander's dates were 356 to 323. According to later rumor, he was so important and so powerful that he wasn't a mere mortal. In fact, he was said to have been the son of Zeus. One of our few sources for the historical Alexander was the Greek author Plutarch. Plutarch lived between 46 CE and 120 CE, so most of his books were being written in the early 2nd century. He's famous for having written two kinds of books. Plutarch wrote a group of moral essays, which were kind of philosophical reflections in essay form. And he wrote a set of parallel lives. The parallel lives are biographies of important Greek and Roman men, and they're called parallel lives because Plutarch would match the life of a Greek with the life of a Roman and publish them as a pair. And so, for example, Alexander the Great was paired with the Roman Julius Caesar. According to Plutarch's version of Alexander's birth, he was born to the ruler of Macedonia, a man named Philip, and his wife Olympias. There were rumors later hatched that Plutarch reports, which says that Olympias, the night before she married Philip of Alexandria, had the dream of a thunderbolt that came down and entered into her body. This was later taken to be an image of Zeus working his magic on Olympias. The other rumor about Alexander's birth is that that same night, Philip looked in on Olympias while she was lying asleep and saw there a serpent in conjugal embrace with her. Now, in many ancient Greek and Roman religions, Zeus was understood often to appear in the form of a serpent. As one might understand, and as Plutarch points out, when Philip saw this, it considerably cooled his passion for his then-to-be wife. In any event, Alexander was said to have been born of this union in which it was Zeus who was his real father, not Philip. A humorous account of this kind of birth between a mortal and an immortal is told by the Roman playwright Plautus. Plautus was a Latin author who wrote a number of plays. Unfortunately, we don't have most of them anymore. The ones we have are outrageously funny. He was a comedic playwright whose most famous work possibly is his book called The Amphitryon. The book is called The Amphitryon because it's named after the main character, a general of the army of Thebes, Amphitryon. Amphitryon is married to a woman named Alcmena. Alcmena has become pregnant by Amphitryon, and Amphitryon, as a general in the army, has gone off to war, leaving his pregnant wife Alcmena behind. Alcmena, by herself, takes care of the household duties, and one day, as it happens, Jupiter, the king of the gods, looks down from heaven and sees Alcmena there with her husband away to war, and is struck by her great beauty. Jupiter, as often happens in myths of this kind, is so taken with her beauty that he decides he has to have her, and he knows how he's going to make it happen. Jupiter assumes the appearance of Amphitryon, who is off at war, and he comes down to Alcmena and announces that he has now returned from war. As one might expect, she welcomes him with open arms, and Jupiter, disguised as Amphitryon, takes her to bed. Jupiter has sex with Alcmena and is enjoying himself so much, according to Plautus, that he orders the constellations to stop moving in the sky. In other words, he makes time stand still. And so this is a very long night indeed. Eventually, even Jupiter has his fill, and he orders the constellations to resume. Time starts up again, and Jupiter then returns to heaven. As it turns out, according to this story, Amphitryon himself, the real Amphitryon, comes home the next day from his war and is very surprised indeed to find out that his wife is not welcoming him more enthusiastically. But the reason is quite clear, because in fact she thinks she spent an evening, a very, very long evening, frolicking in his arms already. The result of this story is that Jupiter also has gotten Alcmena pregnant. Now, some of the people telling these myths, of course, were not altogether current in modern theories and knowledge of anatomy and biology. Alcmena had already been pregnant for a long time by Amphitryon, but now Jupiter gets her pregnant as well. And the result is she bears twins. The son born of Jupiter is none other than Hercules. This is where Hercules comes into being. Hercules is the son of Jupiter and Alcmena. But Hercules has a twin brother named Iphicles. Iphicles is a mortal born to the union of Amphitryon and Alcmena. It's not clear that anyone actually believed that this story of Amphitryon was historical, but it was seen as a plausible view. According to the ancients, sometimes it happened that the gods would have sex with women, and the result was a demigod, someone who was part god and part human, such as Hercules. A third way a human could also be or become a divine being involves a process that is known as apotheosis. The word apotheosis means the act by which a human being is made into a god. As it turns out, there's an instance of this already in a story that I've narrated to you, the story about Philemon and Baucis, who were visited by Jupiter and Mercury. If you recall in this story, Jupiter and Mercury are hosted by Philemon and Baucis, and this elderly couple is rewarded for their hospitality, and they are told that they will be granted any request. Well, their request is that they can be rulers of the shrine of these two gods, and then they might die together. And they die together when they are formed at the end of their lives into a tree with a single trunk with branches coming off in two directions. As it turns out, this tree was worshipped by people who came to visit the shrine, laying wreaths on the boughs. The worshipers said, "They now are gods," referring to Philemon and Baucis. "They now are gods who served the gods. To them who worship gave is worship given." And so Philemon and Baucis were not only granted their request to die together, in death they have been divinized. They have themselves been worshipped and given adoration as gods. More commonly, this divinization of a human being involved great philosophers, or more commonly still, incredibly powerful rulers. We can see this view in a number of ancient writers. One good example is the Roman historian Livy. Livy was one of the great historians of the Roman Empire who lived from 59 BCE up through 17 CE. And so he was writing during the time when the empire came into existence. Rome itself had been ruled for many centuries by a senate, and so was considered to be a republic. But eventually, after a number of civil wars, one of the Roman generals, Octavius, was named as the emperor of Rome, and he became, for all practical purposes, the sole ruler of Rome. And so Rome moved from being an empire to being, from a republic to being an empire. Livy was living during the age of Octavius, who later took on the name Octavian and is known to history as Caesar Augustus. Livy wrote his History of Rome in 142 volumes, most of which don't survive any longer. Book 1 does survive, however, and it's a very interesting book because it deals with the life of Romulus and Remus, the two twins, who both started founding Rome, one of whom, Remus, was killed by his brother Romulus, so that Romulus became the founder of Rome. For our purposes, the most important thing that Livy tells us in his account of Romulus's life is how Romulus was thought to have been taken up to the divine realm as a god at the end of his life. At this point, Rome has been founded and has become a major city. Many buildings, it has large territory, and it has an army. Romulus and the leaders of the people, the Senate, are watching as the troops of soldiers parade in front of them for a special occasion. And suddenly, a thunderstorm comes up, and there's great fog, there's thunder and lightning, nobody can see what's going on, and then the fog lifts. And according to Livy, Romulus was no longer sitting there in public view. Livy tells us that there were two views about what had happened to Romulus. One view was that the senators who wanted to get rid of him as a potential dictator tore him to shreds and hid the parts of his body. The view that became popular, however, was quite different. The more popular view indicated that Romulus had been taken up into heaven. This was the view that was advanced by the members of the Senate, who said that Romulus had been made a god. According to Livy, they said, they all with one accord hailed Romulus as a god and a god's son, the king and father of the Roman city. And with prayers, the senators besought his favor, that he would graciously be pleased forever to protect his children. Here then, we have the senators declaring that Romulus had been taken up to be a divine being. Now, Livy, of course, is somewhat suspicious of this report, and he undoubtedly believes the first one, that the senators had done away with him. But the point is that the senators were able to convince the common people that, in fact, Romulus had been made a god. And later, this report was verified by another figure, a man named Proculus Julius, who says that, in fact, Romulus had come down and spoken with him. According to Proculus Julius, the father of this city, Romulus, descended suddenly from the sky at dawn this morning and appeared to me. So Romulus has come down from heaven, having been made a divine figure. Covered with confusion, says Proculus, I stood reverently before him. Go, he said, and declare to the capital of the world. So let them cherish the art of war, and let them know and teach their children that no human strength can resist Roman arms. And after Romulus said this, he ascended back into heaven. It is interesting that Romulus was thought so much to have been made a god that he became one of the principal gods of the Roman Empire. There was a trio of gods who were worshipped on the ancient hill, the Capitoline. These three gods were Jupiter, the father of the gods, Mars, the god of war, and a god called Quirinus. Quirinus was understood to have been the divinized Romulus. Romulus then was not simply made a minor god, Romulus was made into one of the major gods. The Roman biographer Suetonius discusses how, at a much later time, Julius Caesar was thought to have been made a god after he died. Suetonius is a famous author from the early 2nd century. He wrote 12 volumes of books called The Lives of the Caesars, writing in the year 115 CE. The Lives of the Caesars begins with Julius Caesar as the first. According to Suetonius, after Julius Caesar was killed, murdered at the Ides of March in 44 BCE, there was, of course, a large funeral for him at which Mark Antony delivered the funeral oration. At this funeral oration, Mark Antony called for the Senate to render Caesar all honors, both divine and human. At this point, the Senate voted that Julius Caesar would be recognized as a divine being. In other words, he was deified. Now, it's not in this case that Julius Caesar was being made a god by the vote of the Senate. It's that they were recognizing that he was God. And so Suetonius tells us, Caesar died in the 56th year of his life, and he was included in the ranks of the gods, not only by formal decree, but also by the conviction of the common people. Once again, the people believe that Julius Caesar has been made a god. And as it turns out, something confirmed this belief. At the first games, which were given after his deification by his heir Augustus, so there are games, big games celebrating this deification. At these games, a comet shone, appearing around the 11th hour for 7 days in succession, and it was believed that this comet was the soul of Caesar, who had been received up into heaven. And so there was a divine sign that showed, in fact, Caesar had ascended up to the heavenly realm. Now, in Julius Caesar's case, it's not surprising that his adopted son, Octavian, whom, as I said, later became known as Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor, Octavian actually encouraged the belief that his father had become a god. And it's clear why. Because if his father was a god, what does that make him? With Caesar Augustus, we have the beginning of what is called the emperor cult. The practice of honoring emperors, both dead and living, as gods. The word cult in this context is not a derogatory term referring to a group of crazy people following a dynamic and charismatic leader who urges them and forces them to do all sorts of strange things. In this context, cult doesn't mean that at all. The word cult simply means the care of. And so, for example, we have agriculture, the care of the fields. In ancient Roman religion, they were concerned about the cultus deorum, the care of the gods. The way one cared for the gods was by praying to them and by offering sacrifices to them. There came a point at which the Roman emperors started receiving cult, as if they were divine beings. In other ancient societies, such as Egypt, it was thought that the ruler, the pharaoh, for example, was an embodiment of a god. In Greece, Alexander the Great, some 300 years before Octavian, Alexander the Great accepted divine honors when he conquered Egypt. He conquered Egypt. The Egyptians were accustomed to worshiping their pharaoh as a god, and so Alexander received divine cult. The subjects there made sacrifices to him. So too Roman emperors were accorded such honors that otherwise were reserved for the gods. The relevance of the fact that Roman emperors were treated as gods first hit me when I was making a tour of archaeological sites in Turkey in the year 2010. I was with a friend of mine. We were traveling around Turkey, going simply wherever we wanted to go, wherever there were archaeological sites we could examine. And we ended up one day in Priene, which is a city that was on the west coast of Turkey. It's a very interesting and dramatic setting within a mountain range. It's an ancient city that had been dug up by German archaeologists. These archaeologists had reconstructed parts of the city that was in ruins, but most of it was left in ruins. There were temples and houses and shops and streets. There was a nice theater there, a very large temple to the goddess Athena Pallas. While we were exploring the ruins, there were on the ground all sorts of stones, many of which had inscriptions on them. And looking at one of these inscriptions, I had a blinding realization. As with all of these inscriptions, it was written in Greek. But as I looked at this, I came to realize that, in fact, something really significant was going on in Roman religion precisely when the Christians were calling Jesus God. The inscription on the stone I was looking at referred to the god Caesar Augustus. Now, I knew that for a very long time, scholars had argued that Jesus wasn't the only human being thought to be God, that the emperors also were thought to be God. But for some reason, this had never hit me before. I had to sit down and think about it, because it changed entirely how I was thinking about how Jesus became God. At that point, I was working on my book on how Jesus became God, and I was imagining at that moment, or at least before that moment, that Jesus had become God because of internal developments within Christianity. That what had happened is Jesus had proclaimed certain things during his ministry, and that after his death, the things that he had declared were modified by his followers based on their belief in his resurrection. And that Jesus becoming God was completely an internal development happening within Christianity. It hadn't really hit me before that, in fact, Jesus was being called God precisely when the emperor was being called God, and that this could not have been an accident. Jesus becoming God was not just an internal Christian development of theology, it was a competition between Jesus and the emperor. The more I researched the matter, the more I saw that I was right, and I had to rewrite my book and rewrite this course. The first century Roman orator Quintilian speaks of gods who were born that way, such as Hercules, and of other gods who have won immortality by their valor, he says. In other words, there are other gods who have become gods because of the amazing deeds they said, and he in fact is referring to two of the Roman emperors when he says this, Vespasian and Titus. In the Roman world, normally an emperor would be declared God after he died on the basis of a vote of the Senate. This vote was seen to ratify an emperor's divine status. But it often happened that living emperors were also seen as gods, as can be seen, for example, in an inscription, another inscription, from the city of Pergamum, which has been found, which is dedicated to the god Augustus Caesar. Or another one that has been dedicated in the city of Miletus to the emperor Caligula, who is called Gaius Caesar the god Sebastus. I should point out that Caligula is one of the emperors who insisted on being worshipped as a god while he was an emperor. Later, the Senate did not vote to make him a god, so he ended up, despite his wanting to be a god, losing out. Caesar Augustus, on the other hand, was sometimes recognized as the divine being while he was alive, and was voted by the Senate as being a divine being afterwards. How are we to understand this adoration of the emperor as a divine being? Didn't people realize that in fact he was a mere mortal? That he had bodily functions? That he had limitations? That he could bleed? That he could die? The older view of scholarship was that we should not in fact take seriously this idea that the emperor was a god. According to this older view of scholarship, these people, the emperors, were known to be human, just like everyone else. But the emperor cult, according to this view, in which the emperors were worshipped as gods, was simply political propaganda, which no one really believed. It simply encouraged people to worship these emperors as divine on the logic that if the ruler was admitted to be divine, then he could not be disobeyed. In other words, this is a way of political control. Recent scholarship has reevaluated this older view and offered a very different perspective. As it turns out, there's little evidence that the worship of the emperor was promoted by the officials of Rome itself as a way of controlling people, especially people out in the provinces, so as to make them obedient to Rome. Very rarely did the emperors themselves advocate cult being offered to themselves as divine beings, with Caligula being a notable exception. These emperor cults were grassroots movements in which the rulers were revered for their superhuman power and authority. In this more recent scholarship, whether or not people actually believed in their hearts that the emperors were gods is impossible to know. But the emperors were certainly treated as gods. For example, by having sacrifices performed not only on their behalf, but to them, and by having temples built and dedicated to them. Like the gods, the emperors could perform enormous benefits to their people, and so they had divine-like power. And so they too, as we have seen, could be called God. I should stress that this adoration of divine rulers was not restricted to Rome. I've already pointed out that in Egypt, the pharaohs were thought to be gods, and in other parts of the world, leaders were given divine honors. Because of the great power that they exercised, they were thought to be gods. One example comes to us from the land of Syria. There was a ruler of Syria whose name was Antiochus, whose wife was Laodice. Antiochus had done a very good thing for the city of Teos. Teos had been ruled by a foreign oppressor, and Antiochus had intervened in order to free them from their oppressor. In gratitude, the city of Teos set up cult statues to both Antiochus and his spouse, Laodice. Most telling of all, these two were honored with an inscription in which they were placed on the same level as the local god Dionysus. According to this inscription that's been discovered, Antiochus and Laodice were honored as followed. Having made the city and its territory sacred, and having freed us from tribute, they should receive honors from everyone to the greatest possible extent, and by sharing in the temple and other matters with Dionysus, they should become the common saviors of our city and should give us benefits in common. They are saviors of the city, they're given a temple, they're given worship, and they're placed right up there with the god Dionysus. In short, Jesus was not the only divine man in the ancient world. Others were thought to have been gods who came down to earth temporarily in human form. Yet others were thought to have been literally the Son of a God, who made a woman conceive a child who was then a divine man. And still others were thought to have been taken up into heaven at the end of their lives to live and rule in the divine realm. Jesus, as we will see, was thought to be all three of these things by different Christians in different times and different places.